Hello and welcome to First Look, a Bible study looking ahead to the reading or readings for the coming Sunday. My name's Carl and it's good to have you with us. This week we're looking at a really famous passage in Mark's Gospel which kind of acts as the pivot point in the Gospel where there's a decisive change of direction. Before we dive into that today, if you haven't done so already, however, you might wish to download the sheet that accompanies this study. The link for that can be found just below the video in YouTube. On the sheet you will find the text of today's reading, some other passages you may find it helpful to look up, the questions we'll be pondering later on, and lots of space to record your own thoughts and observations. So without further ado then, let's dive into today's reading, which comes from Mark's Gospel, chapter 8, verses 27 to 38. Today's story takes place on the road, in that Jesus and his disciples were journeying from Bethsaida to Caesarea Philippi, as we see in verses 22 and 27 of this chapter. Now Bethsaida, the former place, is up near the north shore of the Sea of Galilee, whereas Caesarea Philippi is much further up north by the slopes of Mount Hermon and the source of the River Jordan. Even nowadays, taking that journey by car on good roads can take a good couple of hours, so it gives you some idea of the distance. This was no short walk. On the road, Jesus had, as we learn in verses 22 to 26 of chapter 8, cured a blind man who was brought to him by twice laying hands on him. He then sent him home and told him not even to go through the village. Yet again, therefore, he was trying to keep what he was doing in secret, as we saw last week when we looked at chapter 7, verses 31 to 37, and the healing of a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment. Jesus, it seems, isn't doing a very good job of keeping things secret. And as we'll see as we look at the detail of the text, that is the kind of stuff that's brought events to this head, to this pivot point. We've got quite a few different characters in one way or another involved in this scene. So most obviously we have Jesus, who has reached what I guess is the turning point of his ministry, when he's going to turn his face away from Galilee and towards Jerusalem, with all that we know that will bring. We've got the disciples who were on the road with him and include, but weren't limited to, the 12, and they journey with him throughout the region of Galilee. Most notably, of the 12, we've got Peter, who acts as a kind of spokesperson for the group in all of this. He's the first to recognise Jesus as the Messiah, but as we'll see, he was also the first to be reprimanded for not really getting his head round all that meant. In the midst of this, we've also got some other figures that come into play. So we've got, for example, the prophet Elijah, who was the greatest of the Hebrew prophets, and as we learn in 2 Kings chapter 2, did not die, but was carried up to heaven in a fiery chariot. He makes an appearance because it was believed that he would return as the prelude to the Messiah coming. And I'll say more where that fits into the picture later on. And we've also, perhaps slightly surprisingly, got John the Baptist, who was Jesus' older cousin and forerunner, who'd been out in the wilderness proclaiming a baptism of repentance. Herod was quite convinced that Jesus was John the Baptist raised from the dead, after Herod had him unjustly and grisly executed, as we see in chapter 6, verses 14 to 29. So there's a lot going on in this reading from Mark's Gospel, which was the first to be written, aimed primarily, it seems, at a Gentile audience based in Rome. There are other passages that it might be helpful to consider as we look through this reading. And perhaps most notably, it's interesting to compare it with two later accounts from Matthew 16, verses 13 to 28, which has a lot more detail, and Luke 9 verses 18 to 27. They're the two parallel accounts in the Synoptic Gospels, and both were written later. So we set the scene. Let's dive into the detail. As I say, we've reached the pivot point of Mark's Gospel where we're going to move away from Galilee and towards Jerusalem. And there are real parallels between the episode in verses 22 to 26, where Jesus healed the blind man, and Peter's declaration about Jesus being the Messiah in verses 27 to 30. Both involve a degree of secrecy, in that Jesus being the Messiah was a politically dangerous claim to make. And both were two-stage processes. It took 2 goes to properly heal the blind man, and there were 2 questions in verses 27 to 30 that Jesus put to the disciples. So Jesus asked his friends, well, who are people saying that I am? And there was a range of answers that emerged. So some thought he was a prophet, another one in the line of Moses. Deuteronomy 18:15 to 18 gives us a sense of that sort of expectation. And others thought he was a prophet after the kind of line of Elijah or John the Baptist. In other words, a specific person whose coming might herald the arrival of the Messiah. And it gives some idea of the expectation of the crowd, the way that quite a few people in Israel, a lot of people, were longing for someone to come and to transform the situations of the people of Israel in various ways. When Jesus asks these questions of his disciples, the Greek makes it clear that he's asking them collectively. And we see that again in verse 29, when, as on other occasions, Peter answers a collective question on behalf of all of them. Some other examples include chapter 9 verse 5, chapter 10 verse 28, and chapter 11 verse 21. So when Peter, on behalf of all of his friends, calls Jesus Messiah in the latter part of verse 29, he's not at this stage saying that Jesus was divine, though that understanding would come later on. It's more he's saying that he was Israel's true king. He is the heir to the throne of David. And I suspect there were a lot of other expectations building up in all of that, and I'll say a bit more about that shortly. But this claim that Jesus was the Messiah was dangerous, and that's because it would set him on a collision course both with Herod Antipas, the local puppet ruler, but also with the Roman emperor. And it's notable that in the year 20 of the Common Era, a temple had been built precisely to the Roman emperor in Caesarea Philippi, the very place where Jesus and his disciples were heading to on the road. So you can understand, therefore, the request for secrecy that we get in verse 30. And indeed, the messianic secret is a key idea running through the whole of Mark's Gospel. In verse 31, when Jesus begins a new bit of teaching that it's clear was not possible before Peter made this declaration, he uses his favourite title for himself, the Son of Man. Now that reflects some of the imagery we find in places like Psalm 118 verse 22, and also in other places like Psalm 22 or Isaiah 52:13 to 53:12, the Suffering Servant song, and indeed Zechariah chapters 9 to 14. It's the first of 3 predictions Jesus will make about what his being the Messiah actually means, the other 2 being in chapter 9 verse 31 and chapter 10 verses 33 to 34. Now I talked earlier about expectations, and that's because I wonder what ideas Peter and the others had in their heads when they thought of Jesus as the Messiah. Most people believe that the Messiah would cleanse or rebuild the temple, that they would deal with Israel's enemies, so in this case get rid of the hated Roman oppressors, and they would bring God's reign of justice and peace to bear. Jesus, it turns out, was doing these things, but he wasn't doing them in the way many expected. He wasn't a religious revolutionary. He wasn't a military messiah. He was a very different kind of figure. And I wonder if that's part of the reason why Peter was so shocked by what Jesus had to say. Was it his expectations just being so thoroughly messed with that he couldn't cope with it? Don't forget that Peter and many of the others had left behind so much livelihoods, family, in order to follow him. So you could understand, I mean, if it wasn't to do with messianic expectation, why they were not happy being told that they were being effectively asked to follow their friend and leader to certain death. Peter therefore takes Jesus aside and begins to chastise him, but gets given a very hearty rebuke by Jesus in verse 33 when he's told, "Get behind me, Satan." Now that's not saying that Peter was somehow demon-possessed. Rather, what it's saying is that what he was asking of Jesus was so contrary to God's way that basically it didn't have any place if they were going to be authentic followers of him. Verse 34 shows us that Jesus at this point, having chastised Peter, recalls the crowds who've been following him around to come and listen. And he begins to address them all. But the Greek makes it clear that it's kind of like personal to each one of them, even though it's a large number of people. And Jesus talks about how being his disciple means self-denial. It means dying with him by taking up the cross. Taking up the cross in this language doesn't mean carrying a heavy or an inconvenient burden. It means following him to death. It means, therefore, a total and complete commitment. And people were all too familiar with crucifixion and that imagery of taking up your cross. So this isn't a kind of post-Easter recollection that's being fed back into the events of Jesus' life. It's something that would have made immediate and visceral sense to hearers who were used to seeing crucifixes scattered around the countryside that the Romans put there as effectively a way of saying, don't mess with us unless you want that to be you next. Jesus explains in verse 35 that saving our soul means losing it. And he goes on in the verses that follow to give 3 reasons. And the Greek word gar means for. It's like for. The soul here means our inner life. It's like real life in its fullest sense. And so saving our life means embracing our connection with God and losing that connection, as we see in verse 36, in order to gain the world, is ultimately a waste of life. It's a fool's errand. Similarly, in verse 37, Jesus uses commercial language, the language of gift and exchange, to make the same point. And interestingly, it's only Mark's Jesus that talks about being ashamed of the Son of Man, drawing on imagery from Daniel 7, and the consequences of that when it points to his return. We see, for example, a similar kind of thing in chapter 13, verse 2. And we see here the theme of judgment emerging, as in chapter 14, verse 62. So all of that in this final verse. There's so much more one could say. One could be here for hours talking about this passage. And thankfully you'll be glad I'm not going to do that. But I think it really does present a stark challenge to us that we could come at from all sorts of different directions. But the fundamental question is the one that Jesus put to his friends on the road. And who do you say that I am?